Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall, I hope that you are ready to dig in to the story of Abraham. This past weekend, I talked about the few folks remaining on earth today that believe that the earth is flat, or frisbee-shaped in the case of Mike Hughes. It was really a bit of a reverse illustration. Abraham believed that there was one true God. Everybody else on earth believed that there were a lot of little gods, but he alone stood out basically as the one person that had this belief. Of course, if it is reversed, Abraham was correct, and I think that Mike Hughes is bat crazy. Here's what I wonder. Can you think of other cases where one person or a very small group were correct and they stood in contrast to the rest of the world? That's what I think would be a great icebreaker for you. Can you think of maybe current or in history other times that one person or a select few stood in contrast to the rest of the world? I think about maybe the Wright brothers and the idea that we could fly. What would you think about? Well, for 2 weeks in a row, we've dealt with the very same, very important biblical concept, and that is the idea or the practice of a covenant. First Noah and now Abraham. Remember, our definition of a covenant is a promise about the future between two parties. I think because this is the last covenant in Genesis, that this would be a good place for us to look at the 5 major covenants in the Bible. So first, I want you to go back and look at the story of Noah, specifically Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 13. Read those verses. Answer this question. What was promised by God in that covenant, and who was the promise to? And now, let's remind ourselves of the covenant of Abraham. Abraham and the Lord entered into a covenant following the exact same practices of their day, where animals were laid out, halves on both sides of a path, and the two parties walked through those halves together. It was supposed to be a sign that if either one of them broke the covenant, that this was what was going to happen to them. Well, I'd like you to look at Genesis 15, reread verses 9 through 12 and verses 17 through 18, and then answer the same question that you answered before. What was promised by God in this covenant to Abraham, and who was the promise to? Now, let's leave Genesis and turn to Exodus, specifically Exodus 24, and read verses 3 through 8. Again, answering the same question. What was promised by God in this covenant, and who was the promise to? The fourth covenant is the covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 17. This is a covenant that God makes with David. So, the question that you're answering is, what did God promise in this covenant, and to whom was it promised? Now, finally, let's turn to the fifth, the last, the superior covenant in the Bible, and it is in the New Testament. I'd like you to first read Matthew chapter 26, verses 26 through 29, and then turn to the book of Hebrews and read chapter 9, verse 15, answering the exact same question. What was promised by God, in this case Jesus, who is God in the flesh, what was promised by Jesus in this covenant, and to whom was this promise made? Well, digging into covenants. Next, I'd like you to think about the progression of these covenants. This is not going to be an easy thing in your small group. I shared with you during my message on Noah that I think that a great illustration for a covenant is a rocket ship, the stages of a rocket ship, each stacked on top of each other, with the most important piece of the rocket at the very, very top. It's the last stage to launch. It has the astronauts in it, or the cargo. Well, I want you to try to answer the question as to what is the progression in these covenants. If the first covenant was Noah, what was the basic message of the first covenant? The second covenant, that is to Abraham. What is the message in the second covenant to Abraham? How does it build on top of the message to Noah? And then third, what is the message in the covenant to the children of Israel that is made in the Mosaic Law? How does that build on Noah and Abraham? And then fourth, what is the basic message to David? And how does that build on the other covenants? And then finally, What is the basic message of the last covenant? What is the basic message of the payload? What is it that we get in this last covenant, this last final superior covenant? Well, we're going to take a break from the norm for just a second, and I want to show you a little video that I found on covenants that I thought that was very, very good, and so I'll share that with you, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about our favorite and our least favorite things in the passage.
If you've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation, ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that video as much as I did. Let's talk about what we like. I like that Abraham is human. I don't mean that I like that he sins, and I don't mean that it gives me permission to sin, but at the end of the day, here is the person that I think is the most significant character in the Old Testament, the most important person in the Old Testament, and he's still human, and I like that. What do I not like? I don't like that Abraham laughed when God told him that he was going to have a son through Sarah. I don't like that Abraham thought that that was so ridiculous that it was funny. Well, remember the promises that you made this last weekend to yourself and maybe to God, our application, a reminder that faith is where we start. We have a tendency as Christians, the longer that we're in a relationship with God, the more religious that we become, we have a tendency to think that obedience is where it starts. But let's be reminded the message, the story of Abraham, that it starts with faith and obedience grows out of great faith. I hope that you have a great study, and I look forward to seeing you next weekend. Bye-bye.